Zoe Mitchell had just pulled up a concrete slab when she saw it, a metal hatch gleaming in the desert sunlight, unmarked and perfectly preserved after decades buried beneath her new hangar. What she discovered below would force the world to question everything they thought they knew about the Cold War. But she had no idea that government officials were already racing toward her remote location, desperate to keep their darkest secrets buried forever. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The first thing people noticed about Zoe Mitchell wasn't her mechanical expertise or her business sense. It was how she could make a 1967 Mustang purr like it had just rolled off the assembly line. At 28, she had already earned a reputation as one of the finest automotive restorers in Phoenix, but her real dream lay far beyond the city limits, somewhere in the vast emptiness of the Sonoran Desert. That dream materialized on a scorching Tuesday morning in June, when Zoe stood outside Hangar 17 at the abandoned Cactus Ridge airfield, squinting through the heat shimmer at what most people would consider a colossal mistake. The structure loomed before her, like a metallic whale beached on an ocean of sand and scrub brush, its corrugated steel walls bearing the scars of decades' worth of sandstorms and neglect. The realtor, Frank Hayworth, mopped his brow with a handkerchief that had seen better days, and shook his head for the third time that morning. "I still think you're making a mistake, Miss Mitchell," Frank said, his voice carrying the weary tone of a man who had watched too many dreamers crash against the harsh reality of desert real estate. "This place has been sitting empty for 40 years. No power, no water, and the nearest town is 30 miles away. What exactly are you planning to do with it?" Zoe ran her weathered hands along the hangar's sun-baked exterior, feeling the metal's texture through her work gloves. "I'm going to restore vintage aircraft," she replied, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was committing to. "There's a market for it, especially with all the wealthy collectors in Scottsdale and Tucson. This gives me the space I need without the overhead of city rent." Frank's laugh carried no humor. "Aircraft restoration? Have you seen the inside of this place? The concrete floor is cracked to hell, there's no climate control, and I'd bet money there are rattlesnakes nesting in the corners. You're looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars just to make it habitable." But Zoe had already made up her mind the moment she'd seen the listing 3 weeks earlier. The price was right. Barely $60,000 for the entire structure and 20 acres of desert. And something about the hangar's isolated location appealed to her desire for independence. She had spent her entire adult life working for other people, first at Martinez Auto Repair, then at Classic Restorations, always dreaming of the day she could strike out on her own. This hangar represented that freedom, even if it came with a healthy dose of uncertainty. "The paperwork's ready," Frank said, pulling a thick folder from his briefcase. "But I have to ask one more time, are you absolutely certain about this? Once you sign, there's no going back. The previous owner, some government contractor, defaulted on the taxes 20 years ago. The county's been trying to unload it ever since." Zoe accepted the pen and signed her name with a flourish that belied her nervousness. "I've been restoring things since I was 12 years old, Mr. Hayworth. If anyone can bring this place back to life, it's me." 2 hours later, Frank's pickup truck had disappeared into the heat haze, leaving Zoe alone with her new acquisition. She stood in the hangar's cavernous interior, her footsteps echoing off the high ceiling as she surveyed the work ahead. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through gaps in the corrugated walls, and the air carried the musty scent of long abandonment. Frank had been right about the floor, hairline cracks spiderwebbed across the concrete surface, some wide enough to catch the toe of her boot. The hangar was enormous, easily large enough to house 3 full-sized aircraft, with a ceiling that soared 40 feet overhead. Ancient fluorescent light fixtures dangled at odd angles, their bulbs long since shattered or removed. Along the back wall, a series of smaller rooms had once served as offices or storage areas, their doors hanging open to reveal empty spaces filled with debris and the occasional tumble of desert grass that had blown in through broken windows. Zoe pulled out her phone and began documenting everything, taking photos from every angle and making notes about the most urgent repairs. The main hangar doors would need to be completely overhauled, their track systems rusted beyond salvation, The electrical system would require a complete upgrade, and she'd need to install proper ventilation and climate control to protect the delicate aircraft she planned to work on. The list grew longer with each passing minute, but instead of discouraging her, the challenge energized her spirit. By the end of her first week as owner of Hangar 17, Zoe had established a routine that would define the next several months of her life. She would arrive at sunrise, her pickup truck loaded with tools and supplies, and work until the desert heat became unbearable, usually around mid-afternoon. Then she'd return to her apartment in Phoenix, shower off the day's accumulation of dust and sweat, and spend her evenings researching suppliers and planning the next day's tasks. The work was backbreaking. She started with the basics, cleaning decades of accumulated debris and reinforcing the structural supports that showed signs of weakness. The office spaces became her first major project, as she needed a climate-controlled area to store her more delicate tools and eventually house her computer and business records. Day after day, she hauled buckets of rubble, stripped old wiring, and patched holes in the walls, her hands growing more calloused with each passing week. Local residents of Cactus Ridge, the tiny town that served as the nearest civilization, watched her efforts with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. At Murphy's General Store, where Zoe bought her supplies and the occasional cold drink, conversations would quiet when she entered, then resume in hushed tones after she left. The consensus among the locals was clear. The city girl was wasting her money on a fool's errand. "She'll be gone by Christmas," predicted Bill Murphy, the store's weathered owner, as he rang up Zoe's purchase of work gloves and electrical tape. Desert's got a way of humbling folks who think they're tougher than they really are. But Zoe possessed a stubborn streak that had served her well throughout her life, and the doubters only strengthened her resolve. She had grown up in a family where giving up wasn't an option, where her father had taught her that anything worth having was worth fighting for. Those lessons served her well, as summer gave way to fall and the hangar slowly began to take shape under her tireless efforts. The breakthrough came on a cool October morning, when Zoe decided to tackle the most challenging aspect of the renovation: the damaged concrete floor. The cracks were just unsightly. They posed a real problem for moving heavy aircraft and equipment. She had gotten quotes from several concrete contractors, all of whom wanted more money than she had budgeted for the entire project. The solution, she decided, was to do as much of the work herself as possible. She rented a concrete saw and began the laborious process of cutting out the most damaged sections, planning to pour new concrete to create a smooth, level surface. The work was dusty and exhausting, requiring her to wear a respirator and safety goggles that fogged up constantly in the desert heat. But as she worked her way across the hangar floor, removing chunks of broken concrete with a jackhammer she'd borrowed from a friend, she began to notice something odd. The concrete in some areas was much thicker than in others, and the color varied slightly from section to section, as if it had been poured at different times. More intriguingly, there seemed to be a pattern to the variations, with the thickest sections forming what looked almost like a rectangle in the center of the hangar. Zoe initially dismissed this as the result of poor construction practices, but as she continued working, the pattern became more and more obvious. On the morning that would change everything, Zoe was working on removing a particularly stubborn section of concrete when her jackhammer broke through into empty space below. The bit dropped several inches before hitting something solid, and when she pulled it back up, she could see a dark void beneath the concrete slab. Her first thought was that she'd discovered some kind of drainage system or utility tunnel, but when she knelt down and shined her flashlight through the hole, what she saw made her heart race. The light revealed not a pipe or drainage system, but what appeared to be a metal surface, painted the same olive green as military equipment. Zoe widened the hole with her jackhammer, working carefully to avoid damaging whatever lay below. Within an hour, she had exposed enough of the metal surface to see that it was flat and featured what looked like recessed hinges along one edge. It was a hatch, perfectly preserved and apparently untouched for decades. Zoe sat back on her heels, staring at her discovery and trying to process what it might mean. The hangar had supposedly been used for civilian aircraft storage, but military hatches didn't belong in civilian facilities. She thought about the previous owner, described by Frank as some government contractor, and wondered what secrets might lie beneath her feet. The decision to open the hatch wasn't one Zoe made lightly. She spent the better part of that afternoon staring at the metal surface, weighing the potential consequences of disturbing whatever lay below. But curiosity had always been one of her defining characteristics, the same trait that had driven her to take apart her first engine at age 14 and rebuild it just to see how it worked. She cleared away more concrete around the edges of the hatch, revealing a rectangular opening approximately 4 feet by 6 feet. The hinges were substantial and appeared to be well maintained, despite their apparent age. Most intriguingly, there was no visible lock or security mechanism, just a simple recessed handle that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. As the sun began to set on what had started as a routine day of renovation, Zoe Mitchell grasped the hatch handle and pulled. The mechanism moved smoothly, as if it had been recently oiled, opening to reveal a set of metal steps descending into darkness. Cool air flowed up from the opening, carrying with it the scent of machine oil and something else. Something that reminded her of the museums she'd visited as a child. Zoe retrieved a powerful LED flashlight from her truck and began her descent into what she would later learn was one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 21st century. The steps were sturdy and well-constructed, leading down approximately 15 feet before opening into a vast underground space. As her flashlight beam swept across the chamber, Zoe's breath caught in her throat. The underground facility was enormous, easily as large as the hangar above, and possibly larger. But unlike the empty hangar, this space was filled with equipment, documents, and artifacts that looked like they belonged in a military museum. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces covered with precision instruments and partially assembled mechanical components. Filing cabinets stood in neat rows, their contents organized with military precision. And everywhere, covering nearly every surface, were documents, blueprints, photographs, and technical specifications that bore the unmistakable markings of classified materials. Zoe moved through the space like an explorer discovering a lost civilization. She had stumbled upon what appeared to be a secret military facility, one that had been sealed away and forgotten for decades. The equipment was sophisticated beyond anything she had ever seen, featuring technologies that seemed decades ahead of their time. On one workbench, she found components that looked like they belonged on a spacecraft rather than any earthbound vehicle. On another, blueprints detailed aircraft designs that defied conventional understanding of aerodynamics. But it was the documents that truly captured her attention. File after file contained correspondence between military officials, scientists, and government contractors, discussing projects with names like Operation Desert Wind and Project Sandstorm. The dates on the documents ranged from the 1950s through the 1970s, spanning the height of the Cold War. And the classification markings, top secret, eyes only, and cosmic clearance required, suggested that whatever had happened in this facility was considered among the most sensitive secrets of the era. As Zoe explored deeper into the facility, she discovered additional chambers branching off from the main area. One room contained what appeared to be a sophisticated communications center, with radio equipment and encryption devices that looked like they belonged in a spy novel. Another held rows of storage containers, each labeled with cryptic codes and handling instructions. A third room was set up like a laboratory, complete with chemical analysis equipment and specimen containers that made Zoe wonder what kind of research had been conducted there. The most intriguing discovery came in what appeared to be the facility's archive room, where thousands of documents were stored in climate-controlled filing systems. Zoe selected a file at random and found herself reading about experimental aircraft that had been tested in the Nevada desert, vehicles capable of speeds and maneuvers that shouldn't have been possible with 19 Beret 60s technology. The reports described craft that could hover silently, accelerate to incredible velocities, and perform turns that would have been fatal to human pilots. As night fell above ground, Zoe lost herself in the treasure trove of information surrounding her. Each document she examined raised new questions and revealed connections to events she remembered from history classes. The facility appeared to have been connected to several high-profile incidents from the Cold War era, events that the government had either denied or explained away as weather phenomena or experimental military aircraft. One file contained correspondence between facility personnel and officials in Washington, discussing the need to maintain strict secrecy about the project's true nature. The public must never learn the extent of our capabilities. Read one memo dated 1968. The psychological impact would be catastrophic, and our strategic advantage would be compromised. Another document outlined protocols for handling anomalous materials and unconventional propulsion systems, terms that sent chills down Zoe's spine. The implications of what she had discovered began to weigh on her as she finally climbed back up to the hangar sometime after midnight. This wasn't just a collection of old military equipment. It was evidence of secret programs that could rewrite major portions of Cold War history. The aircraft designs alone represented technological capabilities that historians had never suspected the military possessed, and the documentation proved that these capabilities had been deliberately hidden from public knowledge. Zoe spent a sleepless night in her Phoenix apartment, staring at the ceiling and trying to decide what to do with her discovery. She had photocopied several key documents with her phone, and reviewing them in the harsh light of her kitchen only reinforced the magnitude of what she had stumbled upon. This was bigger than she could handle alone, but she also understood that revealing the facility's existence would likely result in its immediate seizure by federal authorities. The next morning, Zoe returned to the hangar with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since signing the purchase papers. She spent the day carefully photographing and cataloging everything in the underground facility, creating a comprehensive record of its contents before anyone else learned of its existence. The work was painstaking, requiring her to document not just the major items, but also the seemingly insignificant details that might prove crucial to understanding the facility's purpose. As she worked, Zoe began to piece together a timeline of the facility's operation. Construction appeared to have begun in the early 1950s, during the height of Cold War tensions. The bulk of the activity seemed to have occurred during the 1960s, when space race competition was at its peak, and both superpowers were pursuing every possible technological advantage. The latest documents were dated 1973, suggesting that the facility had been abandoned sometime in the mid-70s. But why had it been abandoned? And why had it been sealed rather than dismantled? The answers to these questions became clearer as Zoe discovered a series of memos dated late 1973. Budget constraints, political pressure, and changing strategic priorities had combined to make the facility's continued operation untenable. Rather than risk exposure through a formal shutdown process, officials had decided to simply seal the facility and let it fade from institutional memory. All personnel have been reassigned, read one final memo. Physical assets will remain in situ pending future requirements. Facility access is restricted to cosmic clearance personnel only. Official records will reflect standard aircraft storage operations only. The government had literally buried its secrets beneath the desert and waited for time to erase all memory of their existence. If not for Zoe's decision to repair her hangar floor, they might have succeeded. By the end of her second day exploring the facility, Zoe had documented hundreds of items and thousands of pages of documents. The evidence was overwhelming, proving beyond doubt that the United States had possessed technological capabilities during the Cold War that far exceeded anything publicly acknowledged. The aircraft designs incorporated principles that wouldn't be formally recognized by mainstream science for another 2 decades. And the propulsion systems described in the technical manuals seemed to operate on physics that were still considered theoretical. But perhaps most shocking were the operational reports describing actual flights of these experimental aircraft. The documents detailed missions over foreign territory, reconnaissance flights that had gathered intelligence without ever being detected, and test flights that had been deliberately staged to create UFO sightings that would discredit legitimate reports of secret military activities. Operation Blue Phantom successful. Read one mission report from 1967. Target surveillance completed without detection. Cover story of weather balloon released to local media as planned. Another report described a test flight over Arizona that had been observed by multiple witnesses, with official responses blaming the sightings on atmospheric anomalies and mass hysteria. The government hadn't just been developing secret aircraft. They had been using those aircraft to create a deliberate campaign of misinformation, encouraging UFO mythology to provide cover for their actual activities. Every unexplained sighting that couldn't be debunked was allowed to feed into growing public fascination with extraterrestrial visitors, deflecting attention from the very terrestrial but equally extraordinary truth. As Zoe compiled her evidence, she realized that she was sitting on one of the most significant historical discoveries of the century. This wasn't just about military technology. It was about decades of deliberate deception that had shaped public understanding of unexplained phenomena. The implications extended far beyond aviation history into questions of government transparency, scientific progress, and the right of citizens to know what their tax dollars had funded. The decision about what to do with her discovery tormented Zoe for days. She could contact the media and risk having the story buried or discredited. She could reach out to academic historians and hope they would take her seriously. Or she could try to contact government officials and risk having the entire facility confiscated under national security provisions. Each option carried significant risks, but doing nothing felt like a betrayal of the historical truth she had uncovered. The choice was ultimately made for her on a Thursday morning in late October, when she arrived at the hangar to find 2 black SUVs parked outside and 6 men in dark suits waiting by her front door. Her heart sank as she recognized the unmistakable signs of federal agents, their earpieces and professional bearing marking them as clearly as uniforms would have. "Miss Mitchell?" The lead agent, a thin man with prematurely gray hair, stepped forward as she climbed out of her truck. "I'm Agent Davidson with the Department of Defense. We need to talk." Zoe's mind raced as she tried to figure out how they had learned about her discovery so quickly. She had been careful to avoid discussing it with anyone, and she was certain that no one else knew about the underground facility. "What about?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I think you know," Davidson replied, his tone suggesting that denial would be pointless. "We're aware that you've accessed the restricted area beneath your hangar. That facility contains classified materials that are still subject to national security provisions. We need to discuss the situation." Zoe felt a surge of anger at the implication that she had somehow committed a crime by exploring her own property. "I bought this hangar legally," she said firmly. "I was told it was used for civilian aircraft storage. Nobody mentioned any restricted areas or classified materials." Davidson exchanged glances with his companions before responding. The facility was classified above the level that would require disclosure in a civilian sale. The previous security protocols remain in effect regardless of the change in surface ownership. "We're not here to cause problems, Miss Mitchell, but we do need to discuss how to proceed." What followed was a conversation that lasted nearly 4 hours, conducted in the stifling heat of the hangar, while federal agents examined the hatch opening and discussed their options in hushed tones. Davidson explained that the facility had been part of a classified program that officially didn't exist, making the legal situation extraordinarily complex. The government couldn't simply seize the facility without acknowledging its existence, but they also couldn't allow unrestricted access to materials that were still considered sensitive. "We're prepared to offer you full compensation for your property," Davidson eventually said. "The government will purchase the hangar and land for significantly more than you paid, allowing you to pursue your business interests elsewhere. In return, you'll sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding anything you may have discovered here." Zoe had expected this offer, but hearing it spoken aloud still filled her with indignation. "So you want to buy my silence?" she said bluntly. "You want me to pretend that none of this ever happened, that all those documents and aircraft components don't exist? We want to protect national security interests while treating you fairly," Davidson replied, diplomatically. "The materials in that facility, while historically significant, could still compromise ongoing operations if they became public knowledge. Surely you understand the need for discretion in matters of national security." But Zoe had spent too many sleepless nights reading through classified documents to be swayed by appeals to patriotism. "I understand that your government lied to the American people for decades," she said, her voice rising with emotion. "I understand that they developed incredible technologies and then pretended they didn't exist. I understand that they deliberately encouraged UFO myths to cover up their own activities. What I don't understand is why that's still considered acceptable in the 21st century." The standoff continued for another hour, with Davidson's team making increasingly generous financial offers, while Zoe remained steadfast in her refusal to sign any non-disclosure agreements. Finally, Davidson played what he clearly hoped would be his winning card. "Miss Mitchell, you need to understand the broader implications here," he said, his tone becoming more serious. "The technologies described in those documents aren't just historically interesting. Some of them are still classified because they're still in use. Revealing them could compromise current defense capabilities and put American lives at risk. Is your desire for historical transparency worth endangering national security?" Zoe had been expecting this argument, but she had also spent enough time studying the documents to know that most of the technology they described had been surpassed by developments in the private sector. "Agent Davidson," she said calmly, "I've read those files. Most of the aircraft designs are based on principles that aerospace companies figured out decades ago. The propulsion systems use technologies that universities teach in graduate courses. The only thing that's still secret is the fact that the government had these capabilities 50 years before they admitted it." End quote. Davidson's expression revealed that her assessment was more accurate than he was comfortable acknowledging. The government's position was weakening, and both sides knew it. The breakthrough came when Zoe proposed a compromise that she had been considering since first reading the facility's documents. "What if we find a way to reveal the historical truth without compromising anything that's still genuinely sensitive?" she suggested. "I'm not interested in endangering anyone or revealing current capabilities. I just want people to know what their government was capable of during the Cold War." This suggestion sparked a flurry of phone calls between Davidson's team and their superiors in Washington. Zoe spent the rest of the day waiting in her truck, watching federal agents examine her property, and wondering if she would end up in federal prison for the crime of renovating her own hangar floor. But by late afternoon, Davidson returned with an unexpected proposal. "We've spoken with our leadership, and they're willing to consider a controlled disclosure," he said. "You would work with a team of government historians and security experts to identify materials that could be released without compromising current operations. The disclosure would be handled through official channels, ensuring academic credibility while maintaining necessary security restrictions." End quote. Zoe was intrigued but cautious. "What exactly would that look like?" she asked. "The facility would be jointly administered by the Department of Defense and the Smithsonian Institution," Davidson explained. "Academic researchers would be granted access to declassified materials, allowing them to study and publish their findings. You would be credited as the discoverer and given a role in overseeing the historical research. The government gets to control what information becomes public, and you get to ensure that the historical truth isn't buried again." End quote. The proposal wasn't everything Zoe had hoped for, but it represented a significant victory for transparency and historical accuracy. After another day of negotiations, an agreement was reached that satisfied both parties. The facility would be preserved as a historical site, with carefully controlled access for researchers and historians. The most sensitive materials would remain classified, but enough would be revealed to fundamentally change understanding of Cold War military capabilities. The public announcement came 6 months later, after teams of historians and security experts had carefully reviewed thousands of documents and determined what could safely be revealed. The press conference, held at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, sent shockwaves through the academic community and captured international media attention. Dr. Margaret Chen, the Smithsonian's curator of military aviation, stood before a packed auditorium and announced the discovery of what she called the most significant cache of Cold War military documents ever found. And the facility, which she referred to as the Cactus Ridge Archive, contained evidence of secret aircraft programs that had operated for over 2 decades without public knowledge. The materials discovered by Ms. Mitchell proved that the United States possessed aerospace capabilities during the Cold War that far exceeded anything previously acknowledged, Dr. Chen explained to the assembled reporters. These weren't just experimental programs, they were operational systems that conducted missions around the world. The technological sophistication rivals anything we have today. The revelations that followed dominated headlines for weeks. Historians scrambled to revise their understanding of Cold War events, while aerospace engineers marveled at designs that had been developed decades before such technologies were thought possible. The discovery sparked congressional hearings about government secrecy and renewed debates about the balance between national security and public transparency. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the field of unexplained phenomena research. For decades, scientists had dismissed UFO sightings as the result of misidentification, mass hysteria, or deliberate hoaxes. The Cactus Ridge documents proved that many of these sightings had actually been observations of secret military aircraft, flown by human pilots using technologies that seemed impossible to civilian berate observers. We now know that a significant percentage of unexplained aerial phenomena during the Cold War period were actually sightings of classified military aircraft, explained Dr. James Rodriguez, a historian at Georgetown University who was among the first researchers granted access to the declassified materials. The government wasn't covering up extraterrestrial visitation, they were covering up their own technological capabilities. The discovery also raised uncomfortable questions about the deliberate promotion of UFO mythology by intelligence agencies. Declassified memos revealed that officials had actively encouraged public fascination with extraterrestrial explanations as a way to discredit legitimate witnesses to secret aircraft tests. The strategy had been remarkably successful, creating a cultural association between unexplained sightings and science fiction that made it easy to dismiss credible reports. They turned our own curiosity against us, observed Dr. Sarah Williams, a sociologist studying the impact of the revelations. By encouraging wild theories about alien visitors, they made it impossible for anyone to seriously discuss the very real and very terrestrial aircraft that people were actually seeing. The international reaction was equally significant. Foreign governments demanded explanations for surveillance flights that had apparently been conducted over their territory without permission or acknowledgement. Diplomatic tensions flared as countries realized that mysterious incidents from their own Cold War histories might have been the result of secret American operations, rather than atmospheric phenomena or foreign intrusions. For Zoe Mitchell, the woman whose curiosity had started it all, the discovery brought both satisfaction and a measure of vindication. Her decision to purchase the abandoned hangar had been mocked by skeptics who thought she was throwing away her money on a fool's dream. Instead, she had uncovered one of the most important historical finds of the century and forced a reconsideration of decades of hidden history. "I just wanted to fix my floor," Zoe told reporters at the press conference announcing her discovery. "I never imagined that I was sitting on top of something that would rewrite history books, but I'm glad that the truth is finally coming out. People deserve to know what their government was capable of, even if it took 50 years for the story to be told." End quote. The Cactus Ridge facility became a focal point for historians studying Cold War military programs, with researchers from around the world requesting access to its archives. The aircraft components found in the underground workshops were analyzed by teams of engineers, revealing construction techniques and materials that hadn't been seen in any publicly acknowledged programs from the era. The propulsion systems in particular demonstrated principles that wouldn't be formally recognized by civilian science until the late 1990s. But beyond its historical significance, the discovery had a profound impact on public understanding of government secrecy and the relationship between classified programs and democratic accountability. The fact that such an extensive and technologically advanced program could operate for decades without public knowledge raised questions about what other secrets might be hidden in forgotten facilities across the country. Congressional hearings led to new requirements for the declassification of historical materials and greater oversight of programs that operate without legislative knowledge. The phrase "Cactus Ridge moment" entered political vocabulary to describe the discovery of long-hidden government activities that fundamentally changed public understanding of historical events. The facility itself was eventually opened to limited public tours, becoming an unlikely tourist destination in the Arizona desert. Visitors could walk through the underground workshops where secret aircraft had been developed, examine the communications equipment used to coordinate clandestine missions, and view the documents that had been hidden from public view for so long. The tours were carefully controlled, with many areas still off-limits for security reasons, but they provided an unprecedented glimpse into the hidden world of Cold War black programs. For the scientific community, the Cactus Ridge revelations sparked a renaissance in the study of aerospace history and government secrecy. Universities established new research programs focused on uncovering and analyzing classified historical materials. The discovery demonstrated that significant technological developments could be hidden from public view for decades, leading to calls for greater transparency in government research funding. The impact extended to popular culture as well, with the revelations inspiring books, documentaries, and films that explored the reality of secret government programs. The dramatic contrast between official denials and the sophisticated technology revealed in the archives captured public imagination and led to renewed interest in the hidden history of the Cold War era. Perhaps most significantly, the discovery changed the way scientists and historians approached unexplained phenomena. The realization that many mysterious sightings had mundane but classified explanations led to more rigorous investigation methods and a greater willingness to consider conventional explanations for unusual events. The field of anomalous phenomena research became more scientific and less speculative, focusing on verifiable evidence rather than conspiracy theories. As the years passed, additional facilities similar to Cactus Ridge were discovered in other parts of the country, each adding new pieces to the puzzle of Cold War military capabilities. Some were found by accident, like Zoe's discovery, while others were revealed through Freedom of Information Act requests inspired by the precedent she had set. Each new find reinforced the scope of programs that had operated in complete secrecy for decades. The woman who had started it all continued working as an aircraft restorer, but her life had been fundamentally changed by the discovery. Zoe became a sought-after consultant on historical aircraft and a frequent speaker at aviation museums and academic conferences. She used her newfound prominence to advocate for greater transparency in government operations and the preservation of historical sites that might otherwise be lost to development or neglect. History belongs to everyone, not just the people who lived it, Zoe would tell audiences at her speaking engagements. We have a responsibility to preserve the truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable or challenging. The secrets buried beneath the desert weren't just about aircraft and technology. They were about the relationship between citizens and their government. That's a conversation that's as important today as it was 50 years ago. End quote. The Cactus Ridge discovery ultimately became a symbol of the power of individual curiosity to uncover hidden truths. Zoe Mitchell's decision to renovate a forgotten hangar had revealed secrets that might otherwise have remained buried forever, proving that sometimes the most significant discoveries come from the most unexpected sources. Her story inspired others to look more carefully at the forgotten corners of history, leading to additional revelations about government programs that had operated beyond public scrutiny. The underground facility that had been sealed and forgotten for decades became one of the most important historical sites in America, its archives reshaping understanding of Cold War history and government secrecy. The aircraft designs and operational records discovered in its depths provided evidence of technological capabilities that had been hidden from public view for generations, forcing historians to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the era. And it all started with a young mechanic who refused to accept that her dream was impossible, who saw potential where others saw only problems, and who had the curiosity to investigate when she found something that didn't belong. Zoe Mitchell's story proved that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries are made by ordinary people who refuse to ignore the mysteries that others choose to overlook. The desert had kept its secrets for nearly half a century, but in the end, the truth had a way of surfacing, carried upward by the determination of someone who believed that history belonged to everyone and that no secret was meant to stay buried forever. The hangar that had seemed like a foolish investment became the gateway to one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the modern era, changing not just understanding of the past, but also expectations for government transparency in the future. What began as a simple renovation project had become a testament to the power of persistence, curiosity, and the belief that truth, no matter how long buried, would eventually find a way to see the light of day. The concrete floor that Zoe had set out to repair had concealed secrets that would reshape historical understanding and prove that sometimes the most important discoveries are made by those who refuse to accept that something is impossible, even when everyone around them insists that it is. In the end, The skeptics who had mocked Zoe's purchase of the abandoned hangar had been proven spectacularly wrong. What they had seen as a waste of money had actually been an investment in historical truth, a gamble that had paid dividends far beyond anything that could be measured in monetary terms. The mechanic who had bought a forgotten piece of desert real estate had uncovered secrets that would be studied by historians for generations to come, proving that sometimes the greatest discoveries are made by those who have the courage to look beneath the surface of things that others take for granted. The months following the initial revelations brought a steady stream of new discoveries as researchers delved deeper into the Cactus Ridge archives. Dr. Margaret Chen assembled a team of 12 historians, engineers, and intelligence analysts to systematically catalog and analyze the facility's contents. What they found exceeded even the most optimistic expectations about the scope and sophistication of the hidden programs. Among the most startling discoveries was evidence of a parallel space program that had operated alongside NASA publicly acknowledged efforts. Documents revealed that military engineers had developed spacecraft designs in the 1960s that wouldn't be publicly revealed until the Space Shuttle program 2 decades later. The underground facility contained blueprints for reusable orbital vehicles, detailed plans for permanent lunar bases, and correspondence discussing missions to Mars that had been planned for the 1980s. "We're looking at a completely different timeline of space exploration," explained Dr. Rodriguez during a briefing to congressional investigators. While NASA was struggling to reach the moon, military engineers were already designing vehicles for routine access to orbit and planning permanent installations on other planets. The technological gap between public and classified programs was far greater than anyone suspected. The implications extended far beyond historical curiosity. Many of the spacecraft designs incorporated technologies that commercial space companies were still trying to perfect in the 21st century. Propulsion systems described in the classified documents promised dramatically reduced launch costs and increased payload capacities compared to conventional rockets. The discovery suggested that space exploration could have progressed much more rapidly if these technologies had been developed openly, rather than hidden in classified programs. Zoe found herself at the center of an international controversy when foreign governments began demanding access to documents that might relate to their own territories. The archives contained detailed surveillance reports from flights over dozens of countries, many of which had never been informed that such missions had taken place. Some of the intelligence gathered had apparently influenced major diplomatic decisions during the Cold War, raising questions about the legitimacy of international agreements based on secretly obtained information. "The ethical implications are staggering," observed Dr. Patricia Vance, a specialist in international law at Harvard University. "We're talking about decades of foreign policy decisions based on intelligence that was gathered through methods that weren't acknowledged to exist. Treaties were signed, alliances were formed, and military strategies were developed based on information that one side possessed but couldn't admit to having." End quote. The British government was among the first to demand a full accounting of surveillance flights over their territory, particularly after documents revealed that secret American aircraft had monitored British nuclear facilities without the knowledge or consent of their supposed allies. The revelation strained diplomatic relationships and led to demands for new transparency agreements between intelligence services. But it was the discovery of additional underground chambers that truly captured international attention. While excavating around the original facility, archaeological teams found evidence of a much larger complex that extended deep beneath the desert floor. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a network of tunnels and chambers that covered several square miles, suggesting that the Cactus Ridge site was only the tip of a massive underground installation. The expansion of the dig site required approval from multiple federal agencies and triggered a legal battle over who had the authority to authorize such extensive excavations. Environmental groups raised concerns about disturbing the desert ecosystem, while historians argued that the potential discoveries were too important to delay. The debate raged for months before a compromise was reached that allowed limited excavation under strict environmental oversight. The first new chamber to be opened contained what appeared to be a full-scale aircraft manufacturing facility, complete with assembly lines, testing equipment, and quality control stations. The sophistication of the operation rivaled anything in the civilian aerospace industry, with some equipment that seemed to exceed current manufacturing capabilities. Most remarkably, several aircraft appeared to be in various stages of assembly, as if production had been halted suddenly and never resumed. "It's like walking into a time capsule," said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, an aerospace engineer brought in to analyze the manufacturing equipment. The production techniques they were using in the 1970s were decades ahead of what civilian manufacturers were capable of. Some of these machines incorporate technologies that we're still trying to perfect today. The aircraft being assembled in the facility were unlike anything in the historical record. They featured radical design elements that challenged conventional understanding of aerodynamics, including shapes that seemed to defy basic principles of flight. The propulsion systems were particularly mysterious, incorporating principles that mainstream physics textbooks claimed were impossible to achieve with available materials and energy sources. One partially assembled craft appeared to be capable of both atmospheric and spaceflight, with engine configurations that could operate efficiently in air or vacuum. The design documents described performance characteristics that exceeded anything in the current military inventory, including the ability to reach orbital velocity while taking off and landing like a conventional aircraft. If the specifications were accurate, the vehicle could have revolutionized both military operations and commercial space access. But the most intriguing discovery came in a sealed chamber that required specialized equipment to open safely. Inside, researchers found a collection of materials that didn't appear to be of terrestrial origin. The substances exhibited properties that couldn't be explained by known metallurgy, including structural characteristics that seemed to violate basic laws of physics. Some materials were lighter than aluminum but stronger than steel, while others conducted electricity in ways that defied conventional understanding of electrical properties. "We're looking at materials that we simply can't explain with current scientific understanding," admitted Dr. Walsh during a classified briefing to government officials. "The atomic structures are unlike anything we've seen before. Either these materials were created using manufacturing techniques that are far more advanced than anything we possess, or they originated from somewhere else entirely." The discovery of anomalous materials sparked intense debate within the scientific community and raised uncomfortable questions about the source of technologies found in the facility. If human engineers had developed these materials in the 1960s and 70s, it suggested that scientific understanding had progressed much further than public knowledge indicated. But if the materials had originated from other sources, it opened possibilities that most scientists were reluctant to consider. Zoe found herself caught in the middle of increasingly complex political and scientific debates. Her role as discoverer of the facility gave her a unique position, but it also made her a target for conspiracy theorists and skeptics who questioned the authenticity of the finds. Death threats from extremist groups forced her to accept federal protection, while media attention made it impossible for her to continue her normal work as an aircraft restorer. "I never wanted to become a public figure," Zoe confided to Dr. Chen during one of their regular meetings at the site. "I just wanted to fix old airplanes and maybe make enough money to live comfortably. Instead, I've stumbled into something that's bigger than I ever could have imagined, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to handle the responsibility." Dr. Chen, who had become both a colleague and friend during the investigation, understood Zoe's dilemma. "History chose you for this discovery," she replied. "The fact that you weren't looking for fame or recognition is probably why you were the right person to find it. Someone with different motivations might have been tempted to exploit the discovery for personal gain, rather than ensuring that the truth came to light." End quote. The international implications of the discovery continued to grow, as more countries demanded access to documents that might relate to their territories or citizens. The archives contained evidence of surveillance operations, intelligence-gathering missions, and experimental flights that had taken place over virtually every continent. Some of the activities described in the documents would have been considered acts of war if they had been acknowledged when they occurred. The revelation that American aircraft had conducted unauthorized flights over Soviet territory during the height of the Cold War created a diplomatic crisis that threatened to derail ongoing arms control negotiations. Russian officials demanded a full accounting of all flights over their territory and access to any intelligence that had been gathered during such missions. The request put the American government in the impossible position of either revealing operational details that could compromise Kurd capabilities or appearing to stonewall legitimate demands for transparency. Similar demands came from China, North Korea, and dozens of other countries that found references to their territories in the classified documents. The cumulative effect was to call into question the entire structure of international law and diplomatic relations that had developed during the Cold War period. If major powers had been conducting extensive secret operations against their allies and enemies alike, the foundation of trust necessary for international cooperation had been fundamentally compromised. The scientific community faced its own crisis as researchers struggled to understand technologies that seemed to violate established physical principles. The propulsion systems described in the facility's technical manuals operated on theories that hadn't been formally recognized by mainstream physics, while the materials analysis revealed substances with properties that couldn't be replicated using known manufacturing techniques. Dr. Michael Torres, a theoretical physicist at MIT, assembled a team of specialists to investigate the most puzzling discoveries. We're dealing with engineering applications of physics that are at least 50 years ahead of current understanding, he explained to a gathering of scientists at the American Physical Society meeting. Either there was a secret scientific revolution that occurred without anyone in the academic community knowing about it, or we need to fundamentally reconsider our assumptions about what was possible in the 20th century. The investigation into the facility's origins revealed a complex web of contractors, subcontractors, and shell companies that had been established to provide cover for the classified programs. Many of the companies involved had operated for decades without anyone in the civilian world knowing their true purpose. Employees had been recruited from universities and defense contractors with promises of working on cutting-edge projects, but they had been sworn to secrecy about the nature of their work. Interviews with surviving personnel revealed the extraordinary lengths that had been taken to maintain security around the programs. Workers had been compartmentalized so that no individual had complete knowledge of what they were building, and false cover stories had been created to explain the purpose of their work to family members and friends. Some employees had worked their entire careers on advanced aerospace projects without ever learning the full scope of what they had helped create. "We were told we were working on experimental aircraft for the Air Force," recalled Robert Hendricks, a former engineer who had worked at the facility during the 1960s. "I spent 15 years designing propulsion systems that could do things I didn't think were physically possible. When I asked questions about how they worked, I was told that other teams were responsible for the theoretical aspects. It wasn't until I saw the news about the discovery that I realized I had been part of something much bigger than I had ever imagined." The psychological impact on former employees was significant, as many struggled to reconcile their memories of the work they had performed with the official denials that such programs had existed. Some had spent decades believing that their careers had been wasted on projects that were never implemented, only to learn that their work had actually been part of operational programs that had been deliberately hidden from public knowledge. Support groups were established for former personnel who were struggling to cope with the revelation that their life's work had been part of a vast deception. The transition from secrecy to public acknowledgement was particularly difficult for employees who had been forbidden from discussing their professional accomplishments with anyone, including their own families. Many had taken their secrets to their graves, never receiving recognition for contributions to technological development that in some cases exceeded anything in the public sector. The economic implications of the discoveries began to emerge as private companies realized that technologies they had spent billions developing had actually been perfected decades earlier in classified programs. Aerospace manufacturers faced questions about why their research and development efforts had progressed so slowly compared to the rapid advances demonstrated in the secret facilities. Stock prices fluctuated wildly as investors tried to assess which companies might be sitting on undisclosed technologies and which had been pursuing research directions that were already obsolete. Legal challenges emerged from multiple directions as companies, individuals, and governments sought compensation for various forms of damage related to the secret programs. Patent disputes arose over technologies that had been developed in classified programs but later reinvented by civilian researchers. International law experts debated whether surveillance flights conducted without the knowledge or consent of foreign governments constituted violations of sovereignty that warranted reparations. The complexity of the legal issues was compounded by the fact that many of the activities had been conducted by agencies that officially didn't exist, using technologies that weren't supposed to be possible. Traditional legal frameworks proved inadequate for addressing situations where governments had systematically deceived their own citizens and allies about fundamental capabilities and activities. Zoe's personal life became increasingly complicated as the scope of her discovery continued to expand. The federal protection assigned to guard her made it difficult to maintain normal relationships, while the constant media attention created a fishbowl existence that she found exhausting. Attempts to return to her aircraft restoration work were frustrated by security concerns and the overwhelming demands of researchers who wanted her insights into the facility's layout and contents. "I feel like I've lost control of my own life," Zoe admitted during a private conversation with her sister Linda, who had flown in from California to provide emotional support. "Everything I do is scrutinized by federal agents, reporters, and conspiracy theorists. I can't go to the grocery store without someone recognizing me and wanting to discuss classified aircraft programs. I just want to get back to working on old airplanes. But I don't think that's ever going to be possible again." Linda, who worked as a social worker in Los Angeles, had watched her sister's transformation with growing concern. "You've uncovered something that's changed the world's understanding of history," she replied. "That comes with responsibilities you never asked for, but it also gives you opportunities to make sure the truth continues to come out. Maybe instead of trying to go back to your old life, you need to figure out how to build a new one that incorporates what you've learned." The suggestion resonated with Zoe, who had been struggling to find a way forward that honored both her personal desires and the historical significance of her discovery. She began working with Dr. Chen and other researchers to establish a foundation dedicated to uncovering and preserving hidden technological history. The organization would work to identify other classified programs that might be ripe for declassification, while ensuring that sensitive current operations weren't compromised. The Foundation's first major project was the establishment of a comprehensive database of technologies and capabilities that had been developed in secret programs during the Cold War era. The goal was to create a resource that researchers, policymakers, and the general public could use to better understand the true scope of governmental technological development during the 20th century. The project required extensive cooperation between current intelligence agencies and academic researchers, creating new models for balancing transparency with legitimate security concerns. Additional excavations at the Cactus Ridge site continued to yield remarkable discoveries as the full extent of the underground complex was gradually revealed. A deep-level facility contained what appeared to be a complete research and development laboratory, with equipment for testing materials under extreme conditions of temperature, pressure, and electromagnetic radiation. The sophistication of the testing apparatus exceeded anything available to civilian researchers during the 1970s and rivaled equipment used in current national laboratories. Perhaps most remarkably, the deep facility contained a sealed chamber that appeared to house a complete spacecraft, fully assembled and apparently ready for launch. The vehicle was unlike anything in the public record, featuring a design that seemed to blend characteristics of aircraft and spacecraft in ways that challenged traditional categories. Initial analysis suggested that it was capable of both atmospheric flight and interplanetary travel, with life support systems designed for extended missions beyond Earth orbit. Or looking at a spacecraft that appears to be designed for missions to Mars or the outer planets, explained Dr. Amanda Foster, a propulsion specialist brought in to analyze the vehicle. The fuel systems, radiation shielding, and life support capabilities are all designed for journeys lasting months or years. If this vehicle is fully functional, it represents a space capability that officially doesn't exist even today. The discovery of the spacecraft raised profound questions about the true scope of American space capabilities during the Cold War era. If such vehicles had been operational in the 1970s, it suggested that the space race with the Soviet Union had been far more advanced than either side had publicly acknowledged. The implications for current space policy and international cooperation were staggering, particularly if similar capabilities had been developed by other nations without public knowledge. International tensions continued to escalate as more countries discovered evidence of American surveillance or intelligence operations within their borders. The European Union established a special commission to investigate unauthorized flights over member nations, while the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution calling for full disclosure of all Cold War-era secret programs that had affected international relations. The resolution, while non-binding, created significant political pressure for the American government to be more forthcoming about the full extent of classified operations. Congressional hearings were scheduled to examine not just the Cactus Ridge facility, but the entire structure of secret programs that had operated without legislative oversight. The hearings promised to be among the most significant investigations of government secrecy since the Watergate era. Zoe found herself called to testify before multiple congressional committees, despite her reluctance to become further involved in political controversies. Her testimony proved to be compelling and straightforward, focusing on the facts of her discovery while avoiding speculation about the broader implications. However, her appearance before Congress only intensified public interest in her story and made it even more difficult for her to maintain any semblance of privacy. Miss Mitchell represents something that's become increasingly rare in our political discourse, observed Senator Patricia Coleman, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, during Zoe's testimony. She's someone who stumbled upon important information and chose to pursue the truth rather than personal advantage. Her willingness to work with government officials to ensure responsible disclosure while insisting on transparency is a model for how such situations should be handled." End quote. The political ramifications of the discoveries extended far beyond questions of historical accuracy. Current defense contractors found themselves under scrutiny for projects that might be based on technologies originally developed in classified programs decades earlier. The blurred line between public and private research became a source of controversy as taxpayers questioned why they had funded the development of technologies that were then kept secret from the very people who had paid aid. For them, technology transfer policies came under intense scrutiny as researchers documented cases where innovations developed in classified programs had eventually found their way into civilian applications years later, or decades later. The delayed release of technologies raised questions about how much more rapidly scientific and economic progress might have occurred if research had been conducted openly, rather than in secret facilities. The aerospace industry faced particular challenges as the revelation of advanced classified programs called into question the entire trajectory of aircraft development during the late 20th century. Companies that had spent billions developing technologies that turned out to have been perfected decades earlier in secret programs faced shareholder lawsuits and congressional investigations into their research and development practices. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and other major contractors were forced to acknowledge that some of their current projects incorporated principles that had been developed in classified programs during the Cold War era. The admissions raised questions about intellectual property rights, government funding transparency, and the relationship between public research investments and private profits. The scientific community's response to the discoveries evolved from initial skepticism to grudging acceptance as the evidence became overwhelming. Peer-reviewed papers began appearing in major journals documenting the analysis of materials and technologies found at the facility. The publications represented a new category of research that blended archaeology, materials science, aerospace engineering, and intelligence studies in unprecedented ways. Universities established new degree programs focused on the study of classified technological history, recognizing that traditional academic disciplines were inadequate for understanding the complex interactions between secret research programs and publicly acknowledged scientific progress. The interdisciplinary approach required collaboration between historians, scientists, engineers, and policy experts who had previously worked in completely separate fields. Graduate students flocked to these new programs, drawn by the opportunity to study technologies and historical events that were just being revealed to academic scrutiny. The first generation of scholars in this field faced unique challenges, as many of their research subjects were still classified, and their sources were often reluctant to discuss their work even after official buy-in. Declassification. Dr. Chen established a fellowship program at the Smithsonian that brought together researchers from around the world to study the Cactus Ridge materials. The program became a model for international cooperation in sensitive historical research, demonstrating that classified materials could be studied openly while still protecting legitimate security interests. The technological analysis of the facility's contents continued to yield surprises that challenged fundamental assumptions about the progression of scientific knowledge during the 20th century. Materials that had been assumed to be impossible to manufacture with 1970s technology turned out to have been produced in quantity using techniques that were still not fully understood decades later. The propulsion systems incorporated principles that mainstream physics textbooks still described as theoretical possibilities rather than practical technologies. The gap between classified capabilities and public scientific understanding appeared to have been far greater than anyone had previously suspected, raising questions about how scientific progress actually occurs versus how it is portrayed in academic literature. Patent applications began appearing from researchers who claimed to have reverse-engineered technologies found at the facility. The applications created new legal challenges as courts struggled to determine whether technologies originally developed in classified programs could be patented by civilian researchers who had analyzed declassified materials. The question had significant implications for innovation policy and the relationship between government research and private intellectual property rights. The international scientific community split into competing factions over how to handle the revelations about classified research programs. Some researchers argued for complete transparency and immediate declassification of all related materials, while others worried that premature disclosure could compromise current defense capabilities and endanger national security. A middle path emerged through the establishment of international research protocols that allowed controlled access to classified materials for legitimate scientific inquiry while maintaining security restrictions on the most sensitive technologies. The protocols became a model for handling other situations where historical research intersected with contemporary security concerns. The psychological impact of the discoveries on the general public was profound and complex. Surveys revealed that a majority of Americans felt betrayed by their government's failure to disclose the existence of such advanced technological capabilities, while simultaneously feeling proud of their country's scientific achievements. The contradiction created a cognitive dissonance that manifested in increased distrust of government institutions and demands for greater transparency in current research programs. Conspiracy theories flourished in the wake of the revelations, with some groups claiming that the discoveries proved their long-standing beliefs about government cover-ups and secret technologies. Other conspiracy theorists rejected the official explanations entirely, insisting that the materials must have originated from extraterrestrial sources, since human technology couldn't possibly have been so advanced during the Cold War era. The polarized reactions made it difficult for researchers to communicate their findings to the general public, as any statement about the discoveries was immediately interpreted through existing ideological frameworks. Scientists found themselves accused of either participating in government cover-ups or promoting wild conspiracy theories, depending on how their explanations were perceived by different audiences. Educational institutions struggled to incorporate the new historical information into existing curricula, as the discoveries required fundamental revisions to textbooks and teaching materials across multiple disciplines. History courses needed to acknowledge previously unknown technological capabilities, while science courses had to address the gap between public and classified research progress. The challenge was particularly acute in international relations and political science programs, where the revelation of extensive secret operations called into question basic assumptions about how foreign policy decisions had been made during the Cold War era. Traditional frameworks for understanding diplomatic history proved inadequate when major powers had been conducting extensive covert operations that hadn't been acknowledged to exist. As the first year after the discovery drew to a close, Zoe reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning when she had first broken through the concrete floor of her hangar. The simple renovation project that was supposed to prepare her facility for aircraft restoration work had instead revealed one of the most significant archaeological finds in American history. The discovery had cost her the quiet independence she had sought when purchasing the remote hangar, but it had also given her a unique role in ensuring that important historical truths were preserved and shared with the world. The foundation she had established was beginning to make progress in identifying other classified programs that might be suitable for declassification, while the research protocols developed for the Cactus Ridge materials were being adopted by institutions around the world. "I've learned that sometimes the most important discoveries are the ones you never intended to make," Zoe observed during a quiet moment with Dr. Chen at the facility. "I thought I was buying a place to work on old airplanes, but instead I found a place where the future had been hidden in the past. Maybe that's how real progress happens, not through grand plans and deliberate searches, but through curiosity and the willingness to look beneath the surface of things that everyone else takes for granted." End quote. The hangar, that had once stood empty and forgotten in the desert, had become the epicenter of a global reevaluation of Cold War history and government secrecy. The discovery had forced historians to rewrite textbooks, scientists to reconsider the progression of technological development, and policymakers to establish new frameworks for balancing transparency with ESG security concerns. But perhaps most importantly, the discovery had demonstrated that truth, no matter how deeply buried or carefully hidden, had a tendency to surface when approached with sufficient curiosity and determination. The concrete floor that Zoe had set out to repair had concealed secrets that had reshaped understanding of the past, while pointing toward possibilities for a more transparent future. The desert had kept its secrets for decades, but in the end, the relentless curiosity of one determined mechanic had proven more powerful than all the security classifications and bureaucratic obfuscation that had been used to keep those secrets buried. What had begun as a simple desire to fix a cracked floor had become a testament to the power of ordinary people to uncover extraordinary truths, proving that sometimes the most significant chapters of history are written by those who refuse to accept that something is impossible, even when experts insist otherwise. 2 years after the initial discovery, the ripple effects continued to spread across multiple continents and industries. The Cactus Ridge revelation had triggered what historians were calling the Great Declassification, a systematic review of Cold War-era programs that had resulted in the release of millions of previously classified BKAN documents. Each batch of newly declassified materials revealed additional connections between secret programs and historical events that the public had never fully understood. Dr. Chen found herself leading an international consortium of researchers who were working to piece together a comprehensive picture of classified technological development during the 20th century. The project had identified similar facilities in 12 different countries, suggesting that the compartmentalization of advanced research had been a global phenomenon rather than uniquely American practice. British, Soviet, and Chinese archives were revealing parallel programs that had developed similar technologies independently, creating a hidden history of scientific progress that had occurred outside public view. What we're discovering is that the public history of technological development during the Cold War was essentially fiction, Dr. Chen explained to a gathering of international science policy experts. The real innovations were happening in classified programs that operated according to completely different timelines and priorities. The gap between public knowledge and actual capabilities was far greater than anyone suspected. The revelation was particularly shocking in the field of space technology, where newly declassified Soviet documents revealed that both superpowers had developed capabilities that exceeded anything in the current Tamale International Space Station program. Plans for permanent lunar bases, Mars missions, and asteroid mining operations had been seriously pursued by multiple governments during the 1970s, only to be abandoned for political rather than technical reasons. Zoe had gradually adapted to her role as a public figure, though she continued to struggle with the loss of privacy that came with her newfound fame. She had moved from her Phoenix apartment to a more secure location in the mountains outside Flagstaff, where she could work on the aircraft restoration projects that remained her true passion while managing the increasing demands of her foundation work. The Mitchell Foundation for Technological Transparency had grown from a small organization focused on the Cactus Ridge materials to a major institution with offices in Washington, London, and Geneva. The Foundation's work had evolved beyond historical research to include advocacy for greater transparency in current government, research programs, and support for whistleblowers who revealed evidence of excessive secrecy in scientific and technological development. We can't change the past, but we can try to prevent the same mistakes from being repeated, Zoe explained during a speech to the International Association of Science Journalists. The technologies that could have revolutionized energy production, transportation, and space exploration were kept secret for decades, delaying progress that could have benefited all of humanity. We need policies that ensure future scientific breakthroughs serve the public interest, rather than being hidden away in classified programs. The Foundation's most significant achievement had been the establishment of the International Protocol for Scientific Transparency, an agreement signed by 43 nations that created new standards for the declassification of research that no longer posed legitimate security risks. The protocol had already resulted in the release of information about advanced battery technologies, propulsion systems, and materials science breakthroughs that had been developed decades earlier but never shared with civilian researchers. The economic impact of these revelations was beginning to reshape entire industries. Energy companies were scrambling to develop applications for battery technologies that had been perfected in classified programs during the 1980s, while aerospace manufacturers were reverse engineering propulsion systems that offered dramatic improvements in fuel efficiency and performance. Tesla and other electric vehicle manufacturers found themselves competing with technologies that had been developed decades before their companies existed, forcing them to accelerate their research and development efforts to remain competitive. The revelation that high-capacity, fast-charging battery systems had been operational in secret programs since the 1970s had essentially compressed decades of expected technological progress into a few months of frantic commercial development. Similar disruptions were occurring in the aerospace industry, where companies like SpaceX discovered that their revolutionary reusable rocket technologies had been anticipated by classified programs that had achieved similar capabilities in the 1990s. The competitive landscape was being rewritten as established companies struggled to incorporate newly available technologies, while startup firms formed specifically to commercialize declassified innovations. The pharmaceutical industry faced perhaps the most significant upheaval, as declassified medical research revealed treatments and diagnostic techniques that had been developed for military applications, but never translated to civilian medicine. Cancer treatments, neurological therapies, and regenerative medicine techniques that represented the cutting edge of current medical research turned out to have been pioneered decades earlier in programs focused on treating radiation exposure and battlefield injuries. Dr. Patricia Moore, an oncologist at Johns Hopkins who had been granted access to declassified medical research, made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the medical community. We're looking at cancer treatment protocols that were developed in the 1970s and appear to be significantly more effective than current standard treatments, she reported to a gathering of medical researchers. These techniques were developed to treat radiation exposure in military personnel, but they show remarkable promise for civilian cancer patients. We could potentially save thousands of lives by implementing therapies that have been sitting in classified archives for 40 years. The ethical implications of withholding medical advances from the public sparked intense debate within the medical community and led to congressional investigations into the classification policies that had prevented life-saving treatments from reaching civilian patients. Families of cancer victims filed lawsuits alleging that their loved ones might have survived if declassified treatments had been available, creating new legal precedents for government liability in cases involving excessive medical secrecy. Zoe found herself drawn into these broader debates about the ethics of scientific secrecy, despite her preference for focusing on historical rather than contemporary issues. Her unique position as the discoverer of the Cactus Ridge facility gave her credibility with both government officials and transparency advocates, making her an effective mediator in discussions about how to balance legitimate security concerns with the public's right to benefit from taxpayer-funded research. The question isn't whether governments should be able to classify research that could genuinely endanger national security, Zoe argued during a debate at the Brookings Institution. The question is whether the classification system is being used appropriately or whether it's being abused to hide embarrassing mistakes, protect commercial interests, or avoid accountability for policy failures. The evidence from Cactus Ridge suggests that the system has been badly abused, and that's something we need to fix." End quote. The international scientific community had embraced the new transparency protocols with enthusiasm that surprised government officials who had expected resistance to increased disclosure requirements. Rather than viewing declassification as a threat to ongoing research, most scientists saw it as an opportunity to build upon work that had been conducted in isolation for too long. Research collaborations began forming between civilian institutions and declassified programs, creating hybrid projects that combined the advanced technologies developed in secret with the open peer review and publication standards of academic science. These collaborations were producing innovations at an unprecedented pace, suggesting that the combination of classified capabilities with open scientific methods could accelerate technological progress far beyond what either approach could achieve independently. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology established the first academic program specifically designed to study declassified technologies, creating a new field that combined reverse engineering, historical research, and policy analysis. Graduate students in the program were working on projects that ranged from replicating advanced materials found in classified archives to developing civilian applications for military technologies that had never been commercialized. Stanford University followed suit with a program focused on the policy implications of scientific secrecy, examining how classification decisions were made and developing recommendations for reform. The program attracted students from around the world who were interested in preventing future episodes of excessive secrecy that could delay beneficial technological development. International cooperation in declassification efforts was producing unexpected diplomatic benefits as former adversaries found common ground in their shared experiences with excessive government secrecy. Russian and American researchers were collaborating on projects that combined technologies developed independently during the Cold War, while Chinese scientists were sharing advances that had been kept secret for similar reasons. The irony is that the secrecy that was supposed to provide strategic advantages actually prevented all sides from achieving their full potential. Observed Dr. Vladimir Petrov, a Russian physicist who had worked on classified aerospace projects during the Soviet era. "We were all developing similar technologies in isolation, duplicating effort and missing opportunities for advancement that could have benefited everyone. The current collaboration is allowing us to finally realize the full potential of research that was conducted decades ago." The collaboration was particularly fruitful in the field of fusion energy research, where declassified programs from multiple countries revealed complementary approaches to achieving controlled nuclear fusion. Technologies that had been developed independently for weapons programs were being combined in civilian research projects that promised to finally make fusion power commercially viable. The breakthrough came at a joint Russian-American research facility, where scientists used declassified magnetic confinement, techniques developed during the 1980s to achieve sustained fusion reactions that produced more energy than they consumed. The achievement, which had been the holy grail of energy research for decades, was made possible by combining technologies that had been kept secret by both superpowers during the Cold War. "This is what could have been achieved 30 years ago if these technologies had been developed openly," said Dr. Lisa Harrison, the American physicist who led the fusion project. "Instead of competing in secrecy, we could have been collaborating to solve one of humanity's most pressing challenges. The delay in achieving fusion power has cost countless lives and contributed to environmental problems that could have been avoided." The success of the fusion project inspired similar collaborations in other fields, where declassified research was revealing previously unknown capabilities. Quantum computing research accelerated dramatically when classified programs revealed techniques for maintaining quantum coherence that had been developed for cryptographic applications during the 1990s. Medical research benefited from declassified studies of human performance enhancement that had been conducted for military applications but had clear civilian benefits. Zoe's personal journey continued to evolve as she found new ways to contribute to the transparency movement while maintaining her connection to the mechanical work that remained her first love. She had established a workshop at her foundation's headquarters, where she restored vintage aircraft while serving as a living symbol of how ordinary curiosity could lead to extraordinary discoveries. The workshop became a pilgrimage site for young people who were inspired by Zoe's story and wanted to pursue careers in science, engineering, or historical research. She welcomed visitors and took particular pleasure in encouraging young women to pursue technical fields where they were still underrepresented. The most important lesson from my discovery isn't about government secrecy or advanced technology, Zoe would tell visitors to her workshop. It's about the importance of curiosity and the willingness to investigate when something doesn't seem right. I found what I found because I was willing to dig deeper when I encountered something unexpected. That's a skill that applies to every field of human endeavor, not just archaeology or historical research. The educational impact of the Cactus Ridge discovery extended far beyond university programs to influence science education at all levels. Elementary and secondary schools began incorporating lessons about the importance of transparency in scientific research, while science museums developed exhibits that demonstrated how classified research had influenced technological development. The Smithsonian's exhibit on the Cactus Ridge discovery became one of the most popular in the museum's history, drawing visitors from around the world who wanted to see the aircraft components and documents that had been hidden for so long. The exhibit was carefully designed to balance historical education with sensitivity to ongoing security concerns, providing enough detail to convey the significance of the discoveries, while avoiding information that could compromise current defense capabilities. Children who toured the exhibit were particularly fascinated by Zoe's story and the idea that important discoveries could be made by ordinary people who were willing to ask questions and investigate unusual circumstances. Science teachers reported increased interest in archaeology, history, and engineering among students who had visited the exhibit, suggesting that the discovery was inspiring a new generation of researchers. The long-term impact of the Cactus Ridge discovery continued to unfold as researchers gained access to more classified materials and developed better understanding of how secret programs had influenced technological development throughout the 20th century. Each new revelation added another piece to a puzzle that revealed the hidden history of scientific progress and the true pace of technological advancement during the Cold War era. The story had become more than just an account of one woman's accidental discovery. It had become a symbol of the power of individual curiosity to challenge institutional secrecy and reveal truths that had been deliberately hidden from public view. The hangar that Zoe had bought as a simple investment in her mechanical future had become the foundation for a global movement toward greater transparency in scientific research and government operations. As she stood in her workshop on a quiet desert evening, surrounded by the vintage aircraft that remained her passion, Zoe reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with her decision to fix a cracked concrete floor. The discovery had changed her life in ways she could never have anticipated, but it had also revealed truths that needed to be told and sparked changes that could benefit future generations of researchers and citizens who deserved to know what their governments were capable of achieving.